Montana Territory, 1878. The wild frontier had taken more men than the war and twice as many dreams. Zane Dawson figured he'd become like the land itself. Hardened against hope, scarred by too many seasons of frost and fire. At 26, he'd already seen enough bloodshed to last several lifetimes. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rolling plains as Zane guided his horse toward Broken Creek, a settlement barely worthy of its place on any map. His lean frame sat easy in the saddle, though his blue eyes remained alert, scanning the horizon with the practiced wariness of a man who'd learned that trust was a luxury few could afford in the untamed West. "A man's only got himself out here," he muttered to his horse, a chestnut gelding that had been his only constant companion for the past 3 years. "Keep your gun loaded and your heart empty, that's how you survive." Zane had good reason for his creed. 5 years earlier, he'd watched helplessly as renegades raided his family's homestead, leaving behind only ashes and graves. He'd been the sole survivor, having been in town that fateful day. The guilt of living when they had not shaped him into a man who rode alone, took odd jobs as a ranch hand, and never stayed anywhere long enough to form attachments. The wound had scarred over but never truly healed. Instead, it had formed his unspoken belief. Love was a weakness no frontiersman could afford. Caring for others only gave the merciless land another way to break you. What Zane wanted was simple: enough money to keep moving, enough whiskey to dull the memories, and enough distance between himself and anyone who might try to reach beyond his carefully constructed walls. What he needed, though he'd deny it with his dying breath, was to find a reason to stop running. As Broken Creek came into view, Zane adjusted his worn leather hat and straightened his shoulders. The town consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a scattering of houses and businesses along a muddy main street. It wasn't much, but it offered the promise of a hot meal and maybe some work. "Just passing through," he reminded himself as he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post outside the saloon. Always just passing through. He had no way of knowing that Broken Creek would be different. That this unremarkable dot on the frontier would be where his carefully constructed world would begin to unravel. The interior of the Lone Star Saloon was dim and hazy with tobacco smoke. A few scattered patrons hunched over their drinks, while a piano player half-heartedly tapped out a tune in the corner. Zane made his way to the bar, ordered whiskey, and turned to survey the room with his back to the counter, another habit born of hard lessons. That's when he saw her. She sat alone at a corner table, her posture straight and proud despite the hostile glances thrown her way by the other patrons. She was strikingly beautiful, with long dark hair cascading down her back and skin tanned by the sun. Her dress was simple but clean, a blue calico that matched her eyes, and she couldn't have been more than 20 years old. But what caught Zane's attention wasn't her beauty. It was the unmistakable air of isolation surrounding her, as tangible as his own. His observation was interrupted when 2 men approached her table. Even from across the room, Zane could see the fear that flashed across her face before she composed herself. "We told you yesterday you ain't welcome here," said the taller man, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet saloon. "Your kind brings nothing but trouble." The girl stood, gathering a small bundle from the table. "I have as much right to be here as anyone." "Not according to most folks in town," said the second man, grabbing her arm. "Half-breed daughter of a Blackfoot squaw and a white deserter ain't got rights to nothing." Zane had intended to mind his own business. Getting involved in local disputes was exactly the kind of entanglement he avoided. But something about the fierce dignity in the girl's eyes as she tried to pull free struck a chord within him. Before he could think better of it, he found himself moving across the room. "I believe the lady was just leaving," Zane said quietly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "No need to help her out." The men turned, sizing him up. Zane knew what they saw, a lean cowboy with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much killing. Something in his steady gaze must have communicated that he wasn't bluffing, because after a tense moment, the taller man released her arm. "You don't know what you're getting into, stranger," he spat. "That girl's nothing but bad luck and Indian blood." Zane kept his expression neutral. "Her heritage is none of my concern. Her right to finish her drink in peace is." A tense silence stretched between them until the saloon owner intervened. "All of you take your troubles elsewhere. I don't want no gunfight in my establishment." The men stalked away, but not before the shorter one hissed, "Sheriff Harding will hear about this." When they'd gone, the girl regarded Zane with wary curiosity. "I didn't ask for your help." Didn't offer it, Zane replied, already regretting his impulsive intervention. Just don't like seeing two against one. He tipped his hat slightly and turned to leave. Wait, she called. When he paused, she added, thank you, my name is Birdie Willow. Zane Dawson, he nodded curtly. Word of advice, Miss Willow, this doesn't seem like the friendliest place for you. Might be safer elsewhere. A flash of defiance lit her blue eyes. This is my home, or at least it was before my father died. I'm not leaving just because they want me gone. Something in her stubborn resolve touched a long-dormant part of Zane's heart, the part that remembered what it was like to fight for what was yours. Still, it wasn't his problem. He had learned the hard way that other people's troubles could quickly become your own, and out here, trouble usually meant death. Your choice, he said, turning away. Good luck to you. As he walked back to the bar, he told himself he'd done more than enough. He'd be moving on tomorrow anyway, looking for ranch work further north. Birdie Willow and her problems would soon be nothing more than another memory in a life full of places and people left behind. But that night, as he bedded down in the small room he'd rented above the livery stable, her face kept appearing in his mind. There was something in her eyes, a mix of strength and vulnerability that reminded him of someone he'd tried hard to forget. Himself before the raid that took his family. Not your fight, he muttered into the darkness, not your problem. Morning came with unexpected news. The livery owner mentioned that the Rocking H Ranch was hiring hands for a cattle drive. It was good-paying work, and with winter approaching, Zane knew he needed to build up his funds before the snows came. Within an hour, he'd ridden out to the ranch and secured a position. What he hadn't expected was to find Birdie Willow there, working in the ranch house kitchen. Mr. Dawson, she acknowledged when he entered the cookhouse for the noon meal. I see you found employment as well. Seems so, he replied, surprised. You work here. Mrs. Henderson takes no stock in town gossip, Birdie explained as she served him a plate of stew. She judges people by their work, not their parentage. Zane nodded, noticing the confident way Birdie moved through the kitchen. This wasn't a girl looking for charity or rescue. There was a quiet dignity in her demeanor that commanded respect. Those men in town, he asked despite himself. That happen often. Birdie's expression clouded. Often enough. My father was a white settler who married my mother against everyone's wishes. When he died last winter, and with my mother long gone, the town decided I no longer belonged. She straightened her shoulders. But this is my home. I'm not going to be chased away from the only place I've ever known. Zane recognized the determination in her voice, the same stubborn resolve that had kept him alive after losing everything. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something dangerously close to admiration. The cattle drive leaves in 3 days, he said, changing the subject. We'll be gone at least 6 weeks, driving the herd to the railhead in Billings. I know, she replied. I'm going too. Zane nearly choked on his stew. What? Mrs. Henderson asked me to go as the cook's assistant. Her husband is getting too old for the trail, and they need someone who can manage the chuck wagon. Zane frowned. A cattle drive is no place for a woman, Birdie finished, her blue eyes flashing, or for a half-breed. For anyone who isn't prepared for how brutal it can be, Zane corrected, irritated at being misunderstood. Days of dust and heat or freezing rain, river crossings that can drown men and cattle alike, rustlers who'd shoot you for your boots. Birdie held his gaze. I've lived my entire life on the frontier, Mr. Dawson. I've survived things that would break most men. She lowered her voice, including being treated as an outcast by people who once called my father friend. Something in her quiet dignity silenced whatever argument Zane had been about to make. Instead, he found himself saying, then I suppose we'll be trail mates, Miss Willow. She offered a small smile, the first he'd seen from her. I suppose we will. As Zane walked out of the cookhouse, he tried to ignore the unwelcome warmth that smile had kindled in his chest. Getting involved with Birdie Willow in any capacity was asking for trouble. Not only was she clearly fighting her own battles in town, but there was something about her that threatened the walls he'd so carefully built around his heart. No, he decided firmly, he would keep his distance during the drive, do his job, collect his pay, and move on just as he always did, just as he had to if he wanted to survive. But deep down, a voice he'd long silenced whispered that maybe there were worse things than not surviving. Maybe there was something worse than death, never truly living at all. The morning of the cattle drive dawned clear and cool. 3,000 head of cattle stretched across the valley, while 24 cowboys prepared for the long journey ahead. Zane busied himself checking his gear and saddling his horse, deliberately avoiding the chuck wagon where Birdie was helping load supplies. The trail boss, a grizzled veteran named Hank Carter, gathered the men for final instructions. "We've got 6 weeks of hard riding ahead of us, boys. You all know your positions. Keep those dogies moving and your eyes open. There have been reports of rustlers working the northern trails, not to mention the usual hazards." His gaze swept over the group, pausing briefly on Zane. "Got some new faces this drive. Dawson here comes recommended by the Barton spread over in Wyoming, and Miss Willow will be assisting with the chuck wagon." A murmur went through some of the men, but Carter silenced it with a hard look. "Anyone who's got a problem with that can collect their wages now and ride out. Mrs. Henderson vouches for her, and that's good enough for me." No one moved. Carter nodded, satisfied. "Mount up. We're burning daylights." As they set out, Zane found himself riding flank, keeping the herd together and preventing strays. It was dusty, demanding work, but he welcomed the physical challenge. It left little time for unwelcome thoughts, especially those concerning the young woman who drove the chuck wagon with surprising skill. For the first few days, Zane managed to maintain his distance, exchanging only necessary words with Birdie during meals. But on the 4th night, as he sat by the fire nursing a cup of coffee after his watch ended, she joined him, 2 plates of food in hand. "You missed supper," she said, offering him one of the plates. "You need to eat." Zane accepted it with a nod of thanks, lost track of time. Birdie settled beside him, a respectable distance away but close enough for conversation. For a while they ate in companionable silence, watching the flames dance. "Why did you help me that day in the saloon?" she asked suddenly. Zane considered the question. Seemed like the right thing to do. "Most men in these parts wouldn't think so." He shrugged. "I'm not most men's." "No," she agreed quietly, "you're not." After a moment she added, "You're running from something. I recognize it because I've seen that same look in my own eyes." Zane stiffened. "Everyone out here is running from something, Miss Willow." "Birdie," she corrected. "And yes, they are, but not everyone carries it the way you do, like a weight that's grinding you into dust." Her perception unsettled him. "You don't know anything about me. I know you ride like a man who doesn't expect to return. I know you keep your distance from everyone, even when they try to be friendly. And I know you watch the horizon like you're waiting for something terrible to appear." She met his gaze steadily. "Those aren't the habits of a man at peace." Zane set his empty plate aside. "Peace is a luxury few can afford out here." "Is it?" Birdie questioned. "Or is it something we deny ourselves because we're afraid of losing it again?" The question hit too close to home, stirring memories Zane had worked hard to bury. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who barely knows me." "Perhaps that's because I'd like to know you better," she replied simply. "Good night, Mr. Dawson." As she walked away, Zane stared after her, unsettled by the conversation. Birdie Willow saw too much, understood too well. It made her dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat and everything to do with the barriers he'd spent years building around his heart. The next morning, as they prepared to move the herd across a river, one of the cowboys, a young man barely 18, was thrown from his horse in the swift current. Without hesitation, Zane spurred his mount into the water, managing to grab the boy's collar just before he went under. The rescue was quick but left both of them soaking wet in the cool autumn air. Back on shore, as Zane helped the sputtering young cowboy to his feet, he caught Birdie watching from the chuck wagon, a look of admiration clear on her face. Their eyes met briefly before Zane turned away, uncomfortable with her attention. Later, when he approached the chuck wagon for a cup of coffee to ward off the chill, Birdie handed him a dry blanket along with his drink. "That was brave," she said quietly. "You saved Jimmy's life." Zane shrugged. "Anyone would have done the same." "But anyone didn't, you did." She studied him with those perceptive blue eyes. "For a man determined to avoid connections, you have a remarkable tendency to help others." "It's not the same thing," he protested. "Isn't it?" Birdie challenged. "Caring enough to act when someone's in danger sounds like connection to me." Before he could respond, one of the other cowboys called out about a stray calf, giving Zane the excuse he needed to escape the conversation. As he rode away, her words followed him, uncomfortably accurate. Yes, he helped when needed, it was how he'd been raised, but that didn't mean he was looking to form attachments. Doing your duty and opening your heart were entirely different matters. The latter was a risk he couldn't afford to take again. Yet as the days passed and the cattle drive continued north, Zane found himself increasingly aware of Birdie. He noticed her quiet competence, the respect she gradually earned from the other men through her hard work and unfailing courage. He observed how she stood her ground when challenged but never sought conflict, how she found moments of beauty in the harsh landscape and pointed them out to anyone willing to see. And despite his best intentions, he began to look forward to their conversations by the fire after supper. Birdie had a way of asking questions that made him think, of listening that made him want to answer. Little by little, she drew out stories of his childhood in Missouri, his journey west with his parents, his life before tragedy struck. In turn, she shared her own story, her Blackfoot mother who had taught her the ways of the land, her father who had defied convention to marry for love, the difficult balance she'd walked between two worlds her entire life. "Neither side fully accepts me," she admitted one night as they sat beneath a star-filled sky. "The town sees me as Indian, the tribe sees me as white. I've always been caught between worlds." "That must be lonely," Zane said, surprising himself with the observation. Birdie considered this. "It was for a long time, but eventually I realized that not belonging everywhere meant I was free to define myself, to choose my own path." She smiled slightly. "There's a certain power in being an outcast, Mr. Dawson." "Zane," he corrected, the formality suddenly feeling unnecessary between them. "Call me Zane." Her smile widened, transforming her face. "Zane, then." That night, as he kept watch over the sleeping herd, Zane found himself thinking not of the past, but of Birdie. Of her resilience and quiet strength. Of the way she had taken the very thing that made others reject her and transformed it into a source of inner power. For the first time in years, he wondered if there might be another way to live with his own pain, not by running from it or burying it, but by finding meaning despite it. The thought was both terrifying and oddly liberating. The next morning, as they prepared to break camp, 3 riders approached from the east. Carter went to meet them while the rest of the men continued their work, though Zane noticed several hands casually moving closer to their weapons. When Carter returned, his expression was grim. "Those fellows bring news. There's been trouble up ahead. A band of rustlers hit the Diamond B Drive last week, stole half their herd and killed 2 men. They're believed to be hiding out in the foothills. We'll be passing through tomorrow." A murmur went through the group. Cattle rustling was common enough, but the murder of drovers raised the stakes considerably. "We'll double the watch tonight," Carter continued. "And tomorrow we'll proceed with caution. I won't risk the herd or your lives if I can help it, but we can't afford to delay either. The buyer in Billings won't wait forever." That evening, the mood in camp was subdued. Men checked their weapons and spoke in low voices. Zane found himself watching Birdie as she worked around the chuck wagon, concern growing within him. If there was trouble ahead, she would be at risk along with the rest of them. When she finished her chores, he approached her, keeping his voice low. "Birdie, about tomorrow." "I heard," she said, her expression calm. "The rustlers." "It could get dangerous," he hesitated. "Maybe you should stay back with the chuck wagon well behind the herd." Birdie looked at him steadily. "Is that what you'd suggest to any other member of this drive?" "You're not," he began, then stopped himself. "Not what? Not capable, not strong enough." Her voice was soft but firm, "or not expendable." The last word caught him off guard. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" She stepped closer. "Zane, I appreciate your concern, but I won't hide while others face danger. That's not who I am." Looking into her determined face, Zane realized she was right. He wouldn't have suggested any man on the drive hang back for safety. His concern for Birdie went beyond practical considerations, and that realization unsettled him deeply. "Just be careful," he said finally. She smiled slightly. "I always am. And you as well." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Zane felt something shift between them, a recognition of feelings that had been growing despite his best efforts to prevent them. He turned away first, disturbed by the strength of his reaction to her. That night, as he took his turn on watch, Zane found himself reflecting on how quickly Birdie had become important to him. Despite all his efforts to maintain distance, she had somehow slipped past his defenses. Her courage, her resilience, her unwavering honesty, all of it drew him to her in ways he hadn't thought possible again, and it terrified him. Because caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability on the frontier often meant death. His parents had taught him that lesson with their blood. The next morning dawned misty and cool as the drive prepared to enter the narrow valley that would take them through the foothills. Carter arranged the men carefully, placing the most experienced riders at key positions. Zane found himself assigned to ride point, his sharp eyes and steady nerves needed at the front. As he prepared his horse, Birdie approached. "The trail boss says we'll be in the Narrows by noon." Zane nodded, checking his saddle cinch. "It's the most dangerous part. If the rustlers are going to hit us, that's where they'll do it." Birdie hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch on a cord. "My mother gave me this when I was a child. It's a medicine bag for protection." She held it out to him. "I'd like you to wear it today." Surprised, Zane looked from the pouch to her face. "I can't take your mother's gift." "You're not taking it, I'm lending it." Her expression was earnest. "Please, Zane, it would make me feel better knowing you have it." Something in her eyes made refusal impossible. Slowly, he took the pouch and slipped it over his head, tucking it beneath his shirt. The leather was warm against his skin, as if it retained some of Birdie's heat. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded, her eyes conveying more than words could express. "Come back safe." As Zane rode to his position at the head of the herd, the weight of the medicine bag against his chest felt significant in ways that had nothing to do with its physical presence. It represented trust, concern, a connection he denied himself for years. The drive moved steadily into the narrowing valley, the walls rising on either side as they progressed. The cattle were restless, perhaps sensing the tension among the men. Zane scanned the ridgelines constantly, looking for any sign of movement or the telltale glint of a rifle barrel. They were halfway through the narrows when he spotted it, a flash of movement among the rocks high above the trail. He raised his hand in the signal to alert the others, then slowly reached for his rifle. The first shot rang out seconds later, kicking up dust near the led steer. The herd immediately began to panic, threatening to stampede in the confined space. More shots followed, and Zane saw riders emerging from a hidden draw ahead, moving to block their path. "Rustlers!" came the shout from behind, followed by the crack of return fire from the cowboys. Chaos erupted. The herd began to mill in confusion, some animals turning back while others pushed forward. Zane saw Carter and two other men working desperately to prevent a stampede, while the rest of the crew responded to the attack. Through the dust and confusion, Zane caught sight of the chuck wagon. Birdie had taken the reins from the older cook and was skillfully guiding the team to a defensive position behind a large boulder. Even as he watched, she reached for the rifle kept under the seat. A bullet whined past Zane's ear, bringing his attention sharply back to his own predicament. 3 rustlers were advancing from the front, using the panicked cattle as cover. Drawing his pistol, Zane fired at the nearest attacker, forcing the man to dive for protection. The gunfight intensified. From his position, Zane could see that they were outnumbered, at least a dozen rustlers against their crew. But the Rocking H men had the advantage of discipline and cover. Suddenly, above the gunfire, Zane heard a scream that turned his blood cold. Turning in the saddle, he saw that 2 rustlers had circled behind their position and were approaching the chuck wagon. Birdie was exchanging fire with them, but she was pinned down and outgunned. Without hesitation, Zane wheeled his horse and galloped toward her, firing as he rode. One of the rustlers fell, but the other took aim at Zane. He felt a burning pain as a bullet grazed his arm, but he didn't slow. Reaching the wagon, he leaped from his horse and took cover beside Birdie. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, checking her for injuries. "I'm fine," she assured him, reloading her rifle with steady hands. "But there are more coming from the south ridge." Zane peered around the boulder and saw she was right. At least 4 more rustlers were making their way down the slope, intent on cutting off the herd from behind. "We need to warn Carter," he said, calculating their options. "If they surround us completely, we're finished." Birdie nodded grimly. "I'll cover you." Before he could protest, she rose to a kneeling position and began firing precise shots at the approaching rustlers, forcing them to take cover. Her marksmanship was impressive, another hidden talent he hadn't expected. Using her covering fire, Zane dashed toward where Carter and the others were holding their position. As he ran, a thunderous crack echoed through the valley, followed by the sound of falling rock. Looking up, Zane saw with horror that one of the rustlers had dynamited a section of the cliff face directly above where Birdie was positioned. "Birdie!" he shouted, changing direction and sprinting back toward her as tons of rock began to tumble down the slope. She had seen the danger too and was already moving, abandoning the wagon and running toward open ground. But the rockslide was gaining momentum, a cloud of dust obscuring her from view. Zane plunged into the dust cloud, calling her name. Through the choking haze, he caught a glimpse of Blue, her dress, pinned beneath a fallen boulder. His heart nearly stopped until he reached her and found she was trapped but conscious, the rock having caught the hem of her skirt rather than crushing her leg as he had feared. "I'm stuck," she coughed, trying to pull the fabric free. "Go, Zane, the others need you." Instead, he drew his knife and quickly cut away the section of fabric, freeing her. As he helped her to her feet, more gunfire erupted nearby. The rustlers were using the distraction of the rockslide to press their attack. "Can you run?" he asked, supporting her as she tested her weight on what appeared to be a twisted ankle. "Yes," she insisted, though her face was pale with pain. "Go help the others, I'll find cover." But Zane refused to leave her. Supporting her with one arm while keeping his pistol ready with the other, he guided her toward a cluster of boulders that offered better protection. They had nearly reached it when a bullet struck the ground at their feet. "Well, what have we here?" came a voice from behind them. "Looks like we found ourselves a cowboy and his Indian woman." Zane turned slowly, positioning himself in front of Birdie. 3 rustlers stood 15 feet away, guns trained on them. The leader, a scarred man with cold eyes, regarded them with malicious amusement. "Step aside, cowboy," he said. "We ain't got no quarrel with you, just want to have a word with the squaw." "You'll have to go through me first," Zane replied, his voice deadly calm. The leader's smile faded. "That can be arranged." What happened next occurred so quickly it later seemed like a blur. As the leader began to raise his gun, Birdie shoved Zane aside with surprising strength. The rustler's shot went wide. Simultaneously, Zane fired twice in rapid succession, hitting the leader and one of his companions. The third rustler got off a shot that caught Zane in the shoulder, spinning him around. As he fell, he heard Birdie cry out his name, followed by another gunshot. Through a haze of pain, he saw the third rustler collapse, a bullet hole in his chest, and Birdie standing with her small derringer still pointed at where he had stood. She was at Zane's side in an instant, pressing her wadded-up shawl against his wound. "Hold on," she urged, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Just hold on, Zane." Around them, the sounds of gunfire were diminishing. Dimly, Zane realized that the tide of the battle must have turned in their favor. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness claimed him was Birdie's face above his, her lips forming words he couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Don't you dare leave me." Zane drifted in and out of awareness. Fragments of sensation reached him through the fog, the jostling of a wagon, voices raised in concern, the cool touch of water on his lips, the burning pain as someone cleaned his wound. But most consistently, he was aware of Birdie's presence, her hand holding his, her voice murmuring reassurances. When he finally regained full consciousness, he was lying in a tent. The light filtering through the canvas suggested it was daytime. His shoulder was bandaged, the pain dulled to a persistent throb. Turning his head, he found Birdie asleep in a chair beside his cot, her head resting uncomfortably against the tent pole. "Birdie," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. She awakened instantly, relief flooding her face as she saw he was alert. "You're back," she said, moving to help him drink from a canteen. "We were worried. You've been unconscious for 2 days." 2 days, Zane tried to make sense of this. "The herd, the rustlers." "We drove them off," she explained. 3 of our men were wounded, including you, but everyone survived. We lost about 50 head of cattle in the confusion, but most of the herd is intact. Mr. Carter decided to make camp here until you and the others were well enough to travel." Zane processed this information. "You saved my life," he said finally. "That last rustler would have killed me if you hadn't shot him." Birdie's expression softened. "You saved mine first, running into a rockslide to find me. Besides," she added with a small smile, "you were wearing my mother's medicine bag. I knew you'd survive." Zane reached up with his good arm, finding the pouch still around his neck. "I don't know about that, but I'm grateful you were there." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm grateful you're here now." Something shifted in her eyes, a warmth and vulnerability she rarely allowed others to see. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." The simple statement hung between them, laden with meaning. In that moment, looking into Birdie's eyes, Zane felt the last of his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. This remarkable woman, who had faced rejection and danger with equal courage, who had saved his life without hesitation, had somehow become essential to him in ways he had never anticipated. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a strange, quiet certainty. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said, the words emerging before he could reconsider them. And that scares me more than any rustler's bullet. Birdie's breath caught. For a moment she was perfectly still, her eyes searching his face as if to confirm he truly meant it. Then she reached out, her fingers gently brushing his cheek. "Why does it scare you?" she asked softly. Zane closed his eyes briefly, the old pain rising to the surface. "Because everyone I've ever loved was taken from me. My family was killed by raiders while I was in town. I've spent years believing that caring for someone only gives fate a target, that the only way to survive out here is to remain alone." Birdie listened intently, her hand still resting against his face. "And now I'm not so sure." He met her gaze directly. "Meeting you, seeing how you face a world that's been cruel to you with such courage and grace, it's making me question everything I thought I knew." She smiled then, a smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. "Good, because I think I'm falling in love with you too, Zane Dawson, and I've never been one to run from the things that scare me." Something warm bloomed in Zane's chest, a feeling he had thought long dead, now awakening like a dormant seed touched by spring rain. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Where do we go from here?" he asked. "First you heal," she replied practically. "Then we finish this cattle drive. After that," she shrugged slightly. "We figure it out together." Together, the word held a promise Zane had never expected to embrace again. Yet here, with Birdie's hand in his and her eyes reflecting the same cautious hope he felt, it suddenly seemed not just possible, but right. Recovery was slower than Zane would have liked. His wound, while not life-threatening, had cost him blood and strength. For a man accustomed to self-reliance, being dependent on others chafed. But it also gave him time with Birdie that they might not otherwise have had. As she tended his wound each day, they talked, really talked, about their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Zane told her about the guilt he'd carried for not being with his family when they were attacked, about the nightmares that still haunted him. Birdie shared the painful rejection she'd experienced from both the white community and, at times, from her mother's people, about her father's death and the loneliness that followed. "He always told me I had the best of both worlds, not the worst," she said one evening as they sat outside his tent, watching the sunset. "He said I could see things others couldn't because I stood between two realities." Zane considered this. "He sounds like a wise man." He was. Birdie's expression grew thoughtful. "After he died, the town changed. Suddenly I wasn't Matthew Willow's daughter anymore, I was just the half-breed. It was as if they'd been waiting for the chance to push me out." "Is that why you're so determined to stay? Because it was your father's home?" "Partly," she admitted, "but also because running would mean they win." "That the hatred wins," her gaze met his. "I refuse to let fear dictate my choices." The words struck Zane deeply. Wasn't that exactly what he had been doing for years? Letting fear of loss, of pain, of vulnerability determine his entire existence. "You're braver than I am," he said quietly. Birdie shook her head. "Not braver, just differently scarred." She took his hand. "You protected yourself the only way you knew how after experiencing something terrible. There's no shame in that, but maybe now there's a different path forward." The cattle drive resumed a week later, with Zane riding in the chuck wagon until his strength returned. The remainder of the journey was blessedly uneventful. When they finally reached Billings and delivered the herd to the buyer, there was a sense of collective accomplishment among the men. The night before they were to begin the journey home, Carter called Zane to his tent. "Got something for you," the trail boss said, handing over an envelope. "Your wages plus a bonus for taking that bullet." "You earned it." Zane accepted the envelope with thanks. As he turned to leave, Carter added, "Heard a rumor you might not be heading back to Broken Creek with us." Zane paused. He and Birdie had discussed their options, but he hadn't realized their conversations had been noticed. "I haven't decided yet." Carter nodded thoughtfully. "That girl's something special. Don't see many with her kind of grit." He lit his pipe, the flame briefly illuminating his weathered face. "Also don't see many men look at a woman the way you look at her. Reminds me of how I used to watch my Martha, God rest her soul." Uncertain how to respond, Zane remained silent. Carter continued, "Whatever you decide, you've got a place on my crew anytime." "Both of you do," he waved his pipe in dismissal. "That's all, get some rest." As Zane walked back through the camp, he found Birdie waiting for him near the fire. The firelight cast a warm glow on her face, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheekbones and the quiet strength in her eyes. "What did he want?" she asked as he sat beside her. "To pay me, and to let me know we'd both be welcome on future drives." He studied her face. Have you thought more about what you want to do? Birdie gazed into the fire. I've been thinking about my father's land. It's still legally mine, even if the town doesn't want me to claim it. With what I've earned on this drive, I could start rebuilding the cabin, maybe plant a small crop come spring. Alone, Zane asked carefully. She turned to him, her expression open and vulnerable. That depends on you, Zane Dawson. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. In Birdie's eyes, Zane saw something he'd been running from for years, a future, a home. A chance to belong somewhere and to someone again. I've spent 5 years drifting, he said slowly, convincing myself that attachments were dangerous, that the only way to survive was to keep moving. He took her hand. But these past weeks with you have shown me that surviving isn't the same as living, and I want to live again, Birdie, with you if you'll have me. The smile that blossomed on her face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Is that a proposal, Cowboy? I believe it is, he replied, surprising himself with the certainty he felt. I love you, Birdie Willow. I want to build something with you, a home, a life, a family. If you'll have me. Birdie's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll have you. Zane pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long, lonely journey. In that moment, all his doubts and fears seemed to recede, replaced by a quiet certainty that this woman, this love was worth any risk. The return to Broken Creek revealed that news of the Rustler attack had preceded them. The town had heard about the brave stand made by the Rocking H crew, and their arrival was met with more interest than usual. What no one expected, however, was the announcement that Zane Dawson and Birdie Willow intended to marry and settle on her father's land. The reaction was mixed. Some, like Mrs. Henderson and her husband, offered genuine congratulations. Others, particularly those who had been most hostile to Birdie, were openly disapproving. You're making a mistake, Dawson, warned one of the men who had confronted Birdie in the saloon months earlier. That Indian blood will show in your children. You'll never be accepted here. Zane regarded him coolly. Then it's fortunate I've never much cared for the approval of small-minded men. The wedding was a simple affair, held at the Rocking H Ranch with the Hendersons standing as witnesses. Birdie wore a new dress of pale blue calico with wildflowers in her dark hair. Zane, clean-shaven and wearing his best shirt, felt a sense of rightness as they spoke their vows that overwhelmed any lingering doubts. I promise to stand beside you, he told her, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. To face whatever comes together, to build a life where neither of us has to face the world alone again. Birdie's eyes shone as she replied, and I promise to remind you, whenever you forget, that love is not a weakness but our greatest strength. That home is wherever we are together. Their first months together were not without challenges. The cabin required extensive repairs after standing empty for over a year. Winter came early, bringing harsh storms that tested their preparations. And not everyone in Broken Creek welcomed their union. There were slights, snubs, and occasional open hostility. But there were unexpected allies as well. The Hendersons remained steadfast friends. Several of the men from the cattle drive, including Jimmy, the young cowboy Zane had rescued from the river, stopped by to help with the cabin repairs. And gradually, as Zane and Birdie proved they were there to stay, some of the initial resistance began to fade. By spring, the cabin was habitable, and they had planted their first crops. Zane had also started breaking horses for neighboring ranches, his skill quickly earning him a reputation as one of the best in the territory. Birdie began selling herbal remedies she made using knowledge passed down from her mother, attracting customers from as far as 20 miles away. One evening in early summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson, Birdie leaned her head against Zane's shoulder. Are you happy? She asked quietly. Zane considered the question, his arm tightening around her. A year ago, happiness had seemed like a foreign concept, something that belonged to his life before tragedy struck. Now, looking out over the land they were working together, feeling the warmth of Birdie beside him, he found that the answer came easily. Yes, he said simply, more than I thought possible. Birdie smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently over her stomach. Good, because in about 7 months there will be 3 of us. For a moment Zane couldn't speak, overwhelmed by a surge of emotions, joy, fear, wonder, love. Then he turned to her, cupping her face in his hands with a tenderness that still sometimes surprised him. A family, he whispered, our family. Birdie nodded, her eyes shining. Our family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across their land, Zane held his wife close and marveled at how completely his life had transformed. The man who had once believed that the frontier was no place for love, that caring only invited tragedy, now found himself eagerly anticipating a future filled with both. He still carried scars from his past, they both did. But those scars no longer defined them or determined their choices. Instead, they had become part of the foundation upon which they were building something new and precious. A home where love was not just possible but essential, a shelter against the harshness of the frontier. And as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Zane silently thanked whatever fate or providence had led him to Broken Creek, and to the remarkable woman who had taught him that even in the wild, untamed West, love could not only survive but flourish. In Birdie Willow, now Birdie Dawson, he had found not just a wife but a partner, a friend, and a future. Her promise of love had indeed ignited a fire in his heart, one that would warm them both through whatever challenges lay ahead.